The Great Migration was one of the largest movements of people in the U.S. Around 6 million Black people moved from 1910 to 1970. The motivation and force for this movement was to flee from racial violence, pursue economic and educational opportunities, and gain freedom from the oppression and discrimination of Jim Crow. The waves of migration were before and after the Great Depression. The first Great Migration, that lasted from 1910 to 1940, led the Blacks to relocate to northern and midwestern cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Pittsburgh. This happened after the war effort increased the demand for men to fight. The ban on people of color led to an economic and labor supply decline. This led to the opportunity for the Black population to be part of the labor and workforce for non-agricultural industries. People who migrated during the Second Great Migration faced segregation. With housing discrimination due to the restrictions implemented, the foundation for racial disparities and wealth in the United States was created. These laws enforced and upheld racial segregation. Their main purpose was to legalize the marginalization of African Americans. This exclusion led to separation in public institutions like schools, hospitals, cemeteries, offices, neighborhoods, public transport, and even affected cashier windows, phone booths, and water fountains. Jim Crow laws also segregated those of Asian, Hispanic, and Spanish descent. And there were even black and white Bibles to swear to tell the truth on in many parts of the South. The Great Migration also had tragic effects on the health of the Black population. The mortality rates for 65-year-old women increased by 43% and for men 50%. Habits they adapted to, like smoking and drinking, took a toll on their health, as well as the stress caused by being away from home.
Black Belt was and still is a region in the northwestern United States that has a predominantly African American population. The Great Migration included two migrations during different decades. The northward movement here began in the early 1900s with the harsh implementation of Jim Crow laws in the South. However, even with these harmful laws and the amount of African Americans moving north, about 90% of the population decided to stay in the South. Out of the two migrations, the second was the greatest in terms of numbers. After World War II, the South started to experience market shortages and there was a lack of European immigrants in the North, so job shortages were frequent. This allowed African Americans to travel north in search of good job opportunities in industries that encompass metalworking and automotive and others in these fields. In the 1910s to 1920s, the African American population in Chicago increased by about 600%. Some numbers about the Black Belt include that in 1930, African American residents of Chicago who were born in the South numbered about 200,000. The same statistic in 1980 had risen to 500,000, meaning that the Black Belt continued to grow during all of these decades. The native-born African American population percentage also continued to rise, from 27.3% to 66% in the respective years listed before.
The Red Summer of 1919 is a pattern of white-on-black violence that occurred in 1919 throughout the eastern part of the United States, where white supremacist terrorism took place in many of these states, and mostly white mobs were attacking African Americans. The Red Summer refers to racial segregation and riots that occurred in more than 36 cities in the U.S. during the summer and early fall of 1919. Many factors contributed to each city's violent attacks, from political problems to economic problems. After World War I, there was an increase in racial violence, and many of it was directed towards African Americans. Over 100 people lost their lives that year, and many families were left homeless. Many governments didn't want to look at what had happened, and this is what delayed them from taking action, since they didn't want to admit that they couldn't handle the situation. Eventually, they ended up calling the military and other armed forces. Governments started to figure out their position on racial equality and that massive riots weren't good for the economy. NAACP also had to step in, and this is how they expanded in 1919, since they fought in courts and started building alliances in Congress, with mostly Republican senators to fight for federal laws to protect people from illegal actions by mobs. They also pushed for a federal lynching law, but that didn't pass. African Americans also built an agreement through newspapers and magazines like The Crisis. In this article, they mentioned developing art and how the Red Summer of 1919 led to the Harlem Renaissance being started around 1920.
What is the Harlem Renaissance? The Harlem Renaissance is the time period in which African American culture grew, expanded, and thrived. Poetry, prose, painting, sculpture, jazz, swing, opera, and dance all became newfound sources of entertainment for the people living in Harlem and other parts of the United States. The Harlem Renaissance is often described as a spiritual coming of age as African Americans began showing pride in their race. The cultural movement began in Harlem, Manhattan, where the Harlem section held the largest neighborhood of African Americans with a population of 175,000. This large number encouraged more African Americans to settle in this neighborhood, which became a preferred home for African Americans of all backgrounds. Together, they created a new identity as free people by sharing common experiences with one another. They built relationships with each other based off of slavery, emancipation, and racial oppression. The Great Migration played a role in the beginning and success of the Harlem Renaissance because it was able to attract large numbers of African American artists and scholars, which all had their own unique and bright talents. Therefore, the Harlem Renaissance was greatly shaped by the Great Migration, as other similar events took place in Cleveland, Ohio, and Los Angeles. One of the women most influential during the Great Migration was Fanny Hutchinson. Fanny Hutchinson was born and raised in Petersburg, Virginia in 1905. Fanny began working at the age of 13 years old to help contribute to her family. Back in the South, Fanny's father experienced psychological damage due to being in World War I. As a result, she used to babysit younger children. While her other siblings got married, Fanny moved in with her uncle at the age of 21 in Philadelphia, 1926. Fanny started off working in a candy factory as well as a waitress at the Swanks Hotel. When she arrived in Philadelphia, she desired to finish high school as she dreamed of taking a business course. However, her uncle was afraid for her safety as many girls went missing around that time. Fanny worked during the day, so her only option was to take evening classes. Despite all her struggles, she was able to overcome them with determination. By the 1940s, Fanny had operated her own business for 10 years. Later on, she was able to have her own business for 15 years, as well as obtain her own retail groceries and luncheonette. Fanny only saved a little, so she took a loan from a company and used that to her advantage to set up her own business. A great role model for younger children, especially young little girls. Finally, we have Ralph Jones, a dedicated editor, author, and public relations specialist. Ralph was born and raised in Philadelphia in the year of 1906. Since he was primarily based in Philadelphia, Ralph was able to see and analyze the arrivals of African Americans coming from the southern side of the country. During the Great Migration, Ralph was a witness of the tension between the Black Southerners and the African American community already residing in Philadelphia. Ralph attended Howard University. After he graduated in 1931, he decided to return to Philadelphia. It turned out to be one of the best decisions he's ever made, as he was able to work a flourishing career in journalism. He was the editor for the Philadelphia Independent and the Afro-American. Later on, Ralph received an accomplishment and became the executive editor of the Philadelphia Tribune. Not only was Ralph a dedicated editor, but he also contributed to the city of Philadelphia as a public relations specialist for the city. Ralph's work and achievements don't stop, as he was also the first African American to become sergeant of the county detectives. His passion for writing motivated him to write his own novel and biography. His novel, The Pepper Pot Man, and his biography, Charles Albert Tindley, Prince of Preachers, were published in 1982 and contributed to the amazing success of Ralph Jones. Ralph Jones later on passed away in 1991. Truly, Ralph served as an inspiration for the younger generations, especially considering the struggles of the African community during the peak of the Great Migration.
The Harlem Renaissance was said to begin in the 1930s, but the momentum of African American culture truly began in the 1910s, evolving into something quite different by 1939. The cultural celebration, after enduring centuries of slavery and continuous discrimination, gave way to many influencers who impacted the experience of the Harlem Renaissance. Louis Armstrong is a familiar name. The American trumpeter and vocalist changed jazz during the Harlem Renaissance, earning the title of the world's greatest trumpet player at that time. With his popularity, he brought audiences of black and whites together. Archibald John Motley Jr. was another influencer during the Harlem Renaissance. He was an American modernist and one of the great visual chroniclers of 20th century American life. He was one of the first black artists to attend the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. His works portrayed the complexities of life during the Harlem Renaissance, relating back to the audience and creating inclusive art that everyone could feel a part of.